This week, we've talked a lot about Second Life for EV batteries over the years, but what about solar panels? They can last for many decades, so why not send them to Africa where millions live in energy poverty? A listener blows our minds by informing us this is already being done. Guess the future's so bright over there they need secondhand shades.
Australia will lead the way with vehicle-to-grid capabilities coming this summer. And by summer, I mean Christmas, because they do everything backwards down there.
A social media post postulates that one solar panel per person could lift the world's poorest people out of energy poverty. 20 panels and you could be richer than an astronaut.
Yes, because if astronauts are known for one thing, it's how rich they are. The CEO of Exxon is urging the U.S. to stay in the Paris Agreement on climate. That's right, the CEO of Exxon. In other news, up is down, black is white, and cats and dogs are living together. And by the way, this recycled joke gets us ever closer to our goal of using 100% post-consumer recycled jokes.
Thank you for your service, Mr. Stockton. All that and more on this edition of the Clean Energy Show. And also coming up with this week, I come up with a brilliant idea for autonomous buses. And the UK is planning more undersea power cables, which is good to hear.
Yeah, so I signed up for electric heat relief with our local utility. And this is a scheme whereby you pay a little bit less of the carbon tax or the price on carbon that we have here in Canada. And of course, you know, we think this is generally a bad idea. We actually want people to be paying a carbon tax. So
carbon pricing, please. We're going to set off certain people. So be careful.
That's
how
right.
you
Carbon pricing. But of course, the problem is here in Canada, they started an exemption for home heating oil, which is a common thing on the east coast of Canada. And then as soon as there was an exemption for home heating oil, then here where we live, it's like, well, why isn't there an exemption for heating with electricity? And it is not our fault. Anybody that heats their home with electricity here where we live in Saskatchewan, it's not our fault that the grid is dirty and not getting any cleaner because they're not doing anything about it. The utility is a government monopoly. We have no choice but to buy our electricity from them. So it does make some sense that we shouldn't have to pay for their mistakes. So I signed up. I should be getting a 60% reduction on my carbon tax. They base that on the idea that if you heat your home with electricity, probably about 60% of your bill comes from home heating. They did come back to me with a couple of questions. It was supposed to be just sort of an automatic thing because I had signed up previously to tell them my heat was electric, but they double checked. I think they were probably confused by my address. I'm here in the city of Regina, and almost nobody heats their home with electricity here where we live. It's more common like in the north, in rural communities and remote communities. So they did send me a reply and make sure that I'm not using any natural gas. And they also wanted to make sure I wasn't using geothermal. The geothermal is not eligible for some reason, even though that is heating your home with electricity.
It is
because it's like more efficient.
That's not fair, actually, is it?
Because no, it's not fair at all. Yeah,
it's a heat pump that is more efficient, but that doesn't mean you should be eliminated from carbon pricing rebates because you're using it is 100% electricity. There's not anything different about it.
I suspect it's because it's so much more efficient that this 60% reduction formula doesn't really work for geothermal. Because if you do heat with geothermal, it's probably not 60% of your bill for heating. It's probably much less than that.
Well, this whole thing is ridiculous, right? I mean, it's all ridiculous, Brian. But you weaseled your way out of it, and you know, I'm sure the people who did this to get back at the federal government for implementing a price on carbon, essentially to pick political fights, are, you know, I got to tweet this. Do you mind if I tweet this? Not that anyone's on Twitter anymore, but
yeah,
they get it screwed because the people in the politics, they read my tweets. If you hashtag it, I'm finding that they read them. So I'd like to get the information back to them that they're jackasses.
Yeah, well, sure. They need to be reminded of that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there was an election, wasn't there? Was there an election, or was it all a bad dream?
What's there? I I've been asleep for a couple of weeks. I don't know.
There was an election, and if you listen to the show, you probably care about climate change and clean energy incentives and promotion and not belittling. Well, the person who's not going to help that out very much won the United States presidential election, as well as possibly the whole Congress. We'll see. The Senate is. Anyway, there's been a lot of discussion on the internet and in columns and opinion pieces and podcasts about how this is going to affect the transition. I'm going to leave it be. We discussed this on our bonus episode for November, which came out last week for our paid subscribers for the Clean Club on Patreon and on Apple Podcasts and YouTube memberships. So that was out last week, and we had actually, it was fun. You know what?
Yeah,
I found that because the first time we did like full self-driving, we drove around to your car. That was a little bit different. This one was just an audio podcast, but it was nice to just have a conversation without the pressure of, the normal pressures of doing this podcast, and just have a conversation. And it was good to deprogram on the U.S. election, and I sleep a little better because of it, I think.
But yeah, the bonus episodes are going to be a little bit looser, and it's just a chance for us to kind of chit chat. It remains to be seen what obviously is going to happen. A lot of what was in the Inflation Reduction Act is enshrined in law, so hopefully that's somewhat difficult to dismantle. The good news is that politicians are notoriously bad at fulfilling promises. I don't know if you've noticed that.
Yeah.
So, let's hope that continues, and like I say, a lot of it is kind of enshrined in law, and so many companies have planned their next decade based on that bill. So dismantling it could really disrupt things. And so, yeah, it's a slowdown for sure. And given that this is a climate emergency, any kind of slowdown is bad, but China's not going to slow down. Europe's not going to slow down. California is not going to slow down. Many states have their own agenda when it comes to climate. So, that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah. I think that oil and gas is, oil prices have gone down since the election even, but I think that oil and gas is thinking that they've got a clean pathway to do whatever they want. We'll see. Like a lot of the investment in batteries and stuff like that, the battery factories are in red states, like almost, majority of them are in red states. So, or some are purple states like Michigan, I suppose. But yeah, that's what's going on. During our bonus podcast for November, we were asked by one of our Patreon members if we thought climate change, if people would believe climate change, essentially, if they faced a climate disaster. And I responded on the show, but, I just wanted to do it again here to say that I used to think that way, but now I don't. And it's because I can see demonstrable changes in our own climate here in the Canadian prairies, such as wildfire smoke occupying a lot of our days and becoming worse to the point where we can't breathe and we have to lock our doors and windows and turn on the air conditioning even on a moderately warm day that we wouldn't normally have to, let's say a spring or fall day, because of smoke, because we're not supposed to breathe it. There's warnings not to breathe the smoke. The air quality index is very high. So yeah, I just wanted to say that I used to think that way, but then, Florida might be blue if that was the case, because they faced climate disaster after climate disaster. North Carolina suffered greatly, but didn't seem to change that many votes this time around. So I'm just going to leave it there. Now, I had a big feature on robotaxis a few weeks ago, and I was kind of predicting how things were going. And some people might have seen it as an endorsement for a robotaxi world. And it really wasn't. It was just how I think that the world would change if robotaxis happen. Now, there is a huge counter to this from Not Just Bikes on YouTube. It's a pretty popular YouTube channel on transit, trains, and mass transit, and biking infrastructure. And he has a huge problem with cars, always has, this person. He's actually from London, Ontario, but living, I believe, in the Netherlands. He pointed out some things like greed. There would be greed from whoever gets the robotaxi dominance, like Windows or Apple. They're not going to put the price the lowest possible like we are expecting them to because they can. They're going to do it because, if they have a monopoly or a partial monopoly, then it could be bad. So competition would be important. But also, they predicted political maneuvering by these companies, as General Motors did against public transportation. And they'll say, well, we don't need public transportation. We've got these robocut taxis. They're safer. They go faster. And that's another thing he predicts. He predicts they'll go faster because they can, because it'll be safe with technology eventually. And that will increase noise. Once you get to 50 kilometers an hour or 30 miles an hour, the noise from a vehicle is about the same because of tire noise. And I find that true here in my neighborhood. Like my wife driving by in her EV is the same noise as a car with a combustion engine because it's the tire noise at that speed that gets going. So, and they also think that he thinks that there'll be a lot of circling because parking will cost money and they'll just circle. I think we'll have to have policy for having places for them to park. But of course, it would lead to more congestion. And I said this myself, that if I was, myself living in Toronto, 3 blocks from a subway station, I would rather take a robotaxi all the way downtown if it costs the same as the public transit. So that can't happen. You're going to have policy against that because I would do that. And, it's better maybe to take last mile transportation to the subway stop or something like that. He also thinks that people will live again further away from the centers of cities because it will enable cheap, fast, reliable, and, doing something, your office work in the car while you drive. It'll enable sprawl again. So that is there. I think there's a link to that I'll put in your show notes. That is called Not Just Bikes. That's his latest video on YouTube. Now, Brian, I was also thinking about, when I was going to talk about this week, about robo-buses. And I had said something controversially. I said, I don't think buses will be the same when robo-taxis happen or when automated driving happens. But I see, I come from the point of view of our moderate-sized urban center here, which is 250,000 people in an Arctic climate, and not a lot of people are doing last mile when it's pretty cold in the winter through snow and cold. Some people are, and it is possible. If you had the infrastructure, a lot more people, of course, would do it. But I was starting to think about robo-buses maybe in some situations, such as at night, where you could have more people taking buses that are smaller, but because there's no driver, there's no added expense. So maybe you could have more frequent service. And then I thought, well, would a woman want to take a bus at night and, with no driver on it, and you're just there? And then I thought, well, maybe they could have buses just for women. And then I thought they could be pink. And then I thought maybe I shouldn't mention that on the show, but I was actually watching a video on YouTube, and guess what? They exist in Jakarta, Indonesia.
You invented something that already exists.
Yeah, so they have, on some buses, they have an area supposedly safe just for women. And it doesn't look, there's a barrier and stickers on the window that say no guns, no bombs, no drinking, and no male-female couples. But then they show these pink buses that are just for women in Indonesia. I don't know the culture of the situation. Maybe it's, women feel less safe there than they do in our society, which is quite possible. And of course, they're not autonomous. They're driven by people, but they're still women-only buses, which I thought was cool. I mean, it's a big city. But yeah, I'd invented something that I thought maybe I shouldn't even mention. And then seconds later, there it was on YouTube that it actually exists. So I'm not a fool. And I've even got pictures for you here, Brian, if you want to look at them. There's the first one. This is a safe area for women. And then there's the pink bus, which is just a normal bus with pink and some women displayed on the side in infographics. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So the algorithm read your mind.
It did. It's doing that now.
Supposed to do. Yeah. All right. Now from Electrek down to Australia. and they are clearing the way for vehicle-to-grid this summer. But of course, their summer is basically right now. So this is Christmas. They've been talking for a while about a plan to allow EVs to connect to the grid, vehicle-to-grid. And they've been working on the sort of standards for this, and they say they're going to release the standards by Christmas. So this is coming up very soon, like a little over a month from now. And we know from past stories on the show that they have tons of solar power in Australia, which leads to certain peak demand periods, but they're also struggling with things like wildfires, which is causing a lot of blackouts and whatnot. The grid getting wrecked. So they already have lots of virtual power plants, which is typically home batteries. Lots of people have home batteries in Australia, and they can connect together as a virtual power plant and supply power to the grid when it's needed and stop it from going down, perhaps. And but EV batteries are usually bigger. The home batteries are like 13 kilowatt hours, 15, something like that. Car batteries are 50, 60, 70 kilowatt hours. Of course, the downside is they're not always at home and plugged into the grid. But if you think about how big those batteries are, and if they can make this happen, if there's enough of them connected to the grid at one time, this is another virtual power plant. And they're making way for it. The regulations are coming up very soon.
Well, we think about vehicle to grid, when you plug a basic electric car into the grid so that it goes back into the grid to feed the grid when the grid needs it, and you get paid, maybe you make a little bit of money off that, a little bit of extra incentive for that. But they're also sucking in extra energy that the grid wants to get rid of at times too, and you get paid for that in the sense that you maybe get it for free, or maybe you get it extremely cheaply. So if you have a big enough, if say you buy a car with a longer range, like what's the batteries in your longer range vehicles? What size are they?
It's probably 100 kilowatt hours.
Around 100 kilowatt hours. So if you had a car like that, that's for trips, right? You have that for trips, but you could maybe charge it to 60%, and I think you do a lot of the time, especially in the summer. It could suck in extra energy to have 40% to go, and then spit it out back to the grid. And I think that's a great idea, and it's coming. But it's going to suck in extra energy when there's too much power, and that stabilizes the grid. And it also gives it back when there's a sudden demand, and that stabilizes the grid, and you get paid both ways. You make money off of it. It makes things cheaper for you.
Yeah, and we're very fortunate because we have 2 electric vehicles, and we use the Model Y most of the time. Like, we have a single driveway where they can't park side by side. So one car always has to be the first one out. So we tend to just use the Model Y because it's the first one out. So the Model S with its 100 kilowatt hour battery just sits there parked most of the time. We only drive it when we, need both cars at the same time, which isn't that often. But
we'll be the last people to get vehicle to grid because we're so conservative with our power grid here. But and it's dirty.
No, and I will add that this isn't going to be a quick solution. So yes, they're going to announce the rules for this very soon, and it will start happening. But of course, a lot of vehicles don't even have that capability of vehicle to grid. We know the Nissan Leaf has it and has had it for quite a while. And some others, I think with the Cybertruck now, that's the only Tesla that can do vehicle to grid. California was talking about regulations. They often have their own regulations for the automobile industry. They're an early adopter of forcing the auto industry to do things, and they've talked about forcing all automakers of EVs to have vehicle to grid built in. And then, of course, you need an interconnect that can do it as well. So your charger has to be bidirectional somehow or hooked up to the grid. So it's not an overnight solution for Australia or for anywhere else, but this is certainly the start of the process.
Yeah, and we think about public transit, a fleet of buses that are parked mostly overnight that aren't as in use as much, or school buses, which I watched a video from who was it? It was Clean Energy Futures, one of our local climate activist video people on YouTube. And they were talking about a small city, I would say a small city. I can't remember which one it was in Alberta that had electric school buses. But they were having the trouble of finding the connection to the grid necessary because they charged up in about 3 hours usually, or 6 hours. So they're all charging at the same time. They want to expand it. So they're needing to, well, I guess this is Edmonton. There's parts of Edmonton that are doing this, the city in northern Alberta. And it is, they're talking about having different depots instead of one centralized place. They're talking about spreading them out now so that they can have different connections to the power grid, because that is turning out to be a problem. Unless you're, off a major trunk line of the grid, a major transmission line that's coming into the city, which you could locate there. I mean, some people are talking about doing that, but this is just a different way of doing it. It's not like it's, the world is going to be different because of renewable energy and the variability of it all. But you think about all those people having school buses that could feed, those are bigger batteries. And, by the time the sun goes down, whatever's left, they could charge the big peak when people come home from work, because the kids are dropped off, the buses are back at the depot, and then they charge up for cheap overnight because they can. And that's when the demand is low and the price will be low.
Yeah, for my house, for all the electricity I'm using, I had to upgrade from 100 amp service to 200 amp service. But the same thing applies to, like a bus company. They're going to have to upgrade their service, or, like you say, spread out the buses in different charging spots where there is enough power.
Well, we got a lot of listener mail this week, so let's get through it, shall we? It's a big mountain of mail. This is from Alex. Hi, Brian and James. I love the show and listen to it every week. Thanks for providing an encouraging message in the midst of so much discouraging news. And boy, is there discouraging news lately. I work in sustainability, so people often ask me about the service life of solar PV panels. Those are solar panels that produce electricity, and the challenges with recycling them, because, word gets around on Facebook and other crap social media things where people want to disparage renewable energy. And, what about that? Well, there hasn't been much of a need to recycle batteries or recycled solar panels, but yeah, they're figuring out ways now that they're finally doing it. But he says, I'd love to share that although their warranty of solar panels is typically 25 years, and that's what yours and mine are on our roofs, that just protects against panel output dropping below 20%, dropping more than 20% compared to the initial rated output. So after 25 years, you're protected that it's going to give you at least 80% of what you got when you get it, because they go down. Some people say 1% a year, but that depends where you live. Manufacturers are happy to offer this warranty since the so-called degradation usually levels off at only 10%. PV panels have no moving parts, so they don't wear out, although the mounting systems may if they are single or dual axis trackers. I'm looking at you, Barry. The panels themselves are typically taken out of service only because they are being replaced with newer models that are more productive. As I expect you already know, this is called repowering. And what of the old panels? Well, the original PV cell developed by Bell Labs in 1954 is still in the Smithsonian Institution collection and producing power 70 years later, 70 years later. We have a link to that he provided. So there's a long second life for PV panels after they are taken out of service to make way for more efficient units. Often the second life is in the developing world, like sub-Saharan Africa, where entrepreneurs assisted by organizations like Solar Sister, solarsister.org, if you want to look up more on that, they use them to charge mobile phones and e-bikes. And I went and watched a bunch of videos from Solar Sisters, and they also mentioned fans.
Yeah,
to keep cool.
Cooling fans.
So again, he says, I love the show. Thanks for inspiring those of us that are in the biz. Regards, Alex. And you know what? With all the negative news, we have listeners who are actually doing something. And Godspeed to you people. Thank you. What a great letter. And I love learning something new and something great like that. And I did a lot of video watching, trying to find information. I found it really hard to find information on this. But, when I had my solar panels on my roof installed, I asked, because I know they're improving, I said, at what point, because they go down in the amount of output they give over time, not much, but a little bit over time, is there some point in the future where I might want to just replace them because it might be worth my while with panels that produce 20% more, or maybe 30% more because the panels are degraded with the new technology. The newer panels are 20% more or something like that. And at some point, Yeah, he couldn't fathom that. The installer couldn't fathom that. But
yeah,
it's something that people do if you have a connection to the grid, and maybe that connection is bigger than the land you have. You might be incentivized as a business to upgrade to newer panels, like because they're improving, and I think they're going to improve a lot over the next 10 years or so. It might be worthwhile doing that. But the old panels are still worthwhile. And most of them are working perfectly well. And maybe, because they can change lives in Africa.
Yeah, if there was a way I could replace my panels, because of course bifacial panels is the other big development since you and I installed our panels. So I could, theoretically, take the panels off my roof, and I have limited space, right, that faces south. Like I've got 31 panels facing mostly south on my house, and I don't really have anywhere else to put them if I wanted to expand and put up more panels. So, be great if I could take those ones off, send them to Africa, put some bifacial panels up there in the same spot, and maybe increase my output by 30%, for maybe even 50% with bifacial panels.
I think that's just fantastic, because I often love when I hear about solar helping the poorest people in the world. Like I donated to a charity a few years ago, not much, but a few bucks that made one family happy, where you can donate for a little solar panel with a little light attached. And the charities said, how much it changes people's lives to have that. And one of the Solar Sisters videos that are on YouTube, there was a teacher that could prepare lesson plans at night after the sun went down that she couldn't do before, and that improves everything. And of course, you have access to maybe secondhand cell phones, smartphones that will eventually make their way to Africa, hopefully, or places that are developing countries. And then you have access to education, but you need the energy in a village. If you're in a village in rural areas, to charge that phone, or maybe charge an e-bike to go get water. That's something that happens, and things like that, or an e-motorcycle. You need the power to do that. So I'm very optimistic and very excited about the potential for solar empowering people in developing countries to get an education. I mean, when you think about AI is going to make people literate. It's going to teach people not only their own language, but maybe other languages. It's the possibilities are endless. And if you don't have a teacher in your village, the AI maybe is not as good as a human, but because the human touch is, I think, always going to be desirable. But an education from AI is maybe better than none, and that will help people get out of poverty, which really excites me. Brian, this is from the Africa Oil and Gas Report. I found this on the internet. With rapid technological development of mobile module technology, that's solar module, in the last decade alone, new modules are attractive to power plant operators for economic reasons due to their higher output, as we were talking about, and same surface area. So you get more out of the same area, more electricity. And so-called repowering involves dismantling old modules and replacing them with new, more powerful modules, even though these may still be operational. Extensive experience with field-aged modules, that is, modules that have been out in the sun for a long time. And by the way, we live in a cold climate. They do better here than, say, in Arizona. They're get more oomph to them afterwards. And that would be true for much of Europe and places like that. So the Solar Lab laboratory reveals that even after more than two decades of operation, the majority of modules exhibit almost no performance degradation, particularly at sites with a temperature climate as found in Central Europe. According to the experience of the project partner Second Life Solar, around 70% of all discarded modules remain directly operational. In order to improve these numbers even more, the project is assessing a variety of additional repair solutions. So sometimes maybe they can be repaired if they aren't operational. It doesn't take much more than a solder or two, perhaps. Moreover, according to the waste recycling industry company Second Life Solar, the amount of old modules that are currently being properly discarded does not correspond with their anticipated amounts in the future. So we expect, after solar farms, vast solar farms start to get replaced, they also need in Africa second-use batteries as well. So, I mean, we talk about batteries in an electric car that lasts, say you have a car for 20 years and it goes away to the graveyard, the automotive graveyard. Maybe the battery is still 60, 70% of what it was that's still useful. So people, yeah, they take apart those batteries, they take the module sections of them, and they use them for home power and other projects like that. Well, Nissan was taking modules from their Nissan Leaf, 10 years ago and powering streetlights, solar-powered streetlights. So the solar would charge up that little part of the electric vehicle battery, which is maybe the size of a textbook or a phone book. And then you would need a power grid to power lights in the mountains or places like that where there wasn't power readily available for streetlights. So they could do that for Africa, for a household, to have a module from a car battery or from other batteries that are still useful, and it would be very useful to them to extend whatever solar, if you have a solar panel and extend it into the night hours. Households, okay. Listen to this. According to the World Bank, West Africa has one of the lowest rates of electricity access in the world, limited to around 42% of the total population. This is West Africa. And 8%, just 8% of rural people have any access to electricity, which is not good for them getting out of poverty. Households without access to electricity are often spending a big chunk of their income on fuel for generators and kerosene for lighting, which is also, of course, expensive but polluting and dangerous, with kerosene lamps starting fires and emissions contributing to, lung problems in people. So this is also happening in rural India. That's a great thing, and I'm very excited about it. It's one of the most excited things that I am about that we talk about on the show. One solar panel person per person. This is a concept tweeted recently by Jesse Pelton, and he says one solar panel the size of a sheet of plywood, basically one of the bigger solar panels you can buy now, puts out about 720 watts, not including the bifacial part of it that comes from the back end. One solar panel the size of a sheet of plywood can generate enough electricity to lift a person out of energy poverty. Not poverty, energy poverty. A single sheet of plywood, that's how much space we're talking about. 10 sheets of plywood per person would get them to the American levels of electricity on average of energy that they use, just 10 panels. But that's not just household use, Brian. That's total electricity, like homes, industry, everything that person relies on. 10 panels would power everything to the American level. Now, you can get panels that are over 700 watts or so now, but that's before, like I said, the bifacial gain. The panel I'm using for this example, he says, is warranted to 87% of its initial output after 30 years. That's crazy. They're getting so good now. And after 30 years, it will still be more efficient than a brand new panel from just a few years before now. So a single solar panel, I went down to the hardware store and bought one for my tent trailer to charge the battery if I was off grid. And that's how I got really my first foray into solar, and the changing the panel, different angles, and knowing how all that works just from hands-on. Well, he's got a graph here that shows the energy poverty line if you got to one solar panel. Just one solar panel. And all the countries below that are good solar countries that would be lifted out of energy poverty. There are examples like India and Haiti, for example. All the places that are poorest have really great solar and would be easily lifted out of energy poverty with one panel. I mean, one panel is not free, but if you're recycling them, like our listener has said, and you put to a second use, that's amazing. And Clean Technica picked up on this social media post and did an article about it. And there was also a New York Times editorial quoted in this Clean Technica article, and it says this: in today's digital world, nothing matters more to individual well-being than energy. Access to electricity determines fundamental aspects of individuals' lives, like whether they are healthy or have a job. And that means the world needs to focus on investment and effort into getting reliable, clean energy to nearly 700 million people who don't have any, and 3.1 billion who don't have enough energy. This is a large chunk of the world, Brian, that could be lifted out with one solar panel. And there's going to be a lot of them. We need to support organizations, and I encourage our listeners to do that, to seek out people who are doing that, because it makes a big difference. I mean, you can give a few bucks to somebody, and it doesn't change their life. Solar changes lives, and that's an amazing thing.
Yeah, and solar panels are increasing production all the time and getting more plentiful and cheaper all the time, which is amazing. All right, we have yet more listener mail. This is a voicemail, which we get at speakpipe.com/clean energy show. And this is from Nate, who is the chief scientist at Oregon Seaweed.
Oh, Brian, I was going to play a joke on him and have like a car screeching and the semi-truck blowing its horn. But then I thought, yeah, I could kill somebody doing that because, we know so many of our listeners are in his situation. Same situation as Nate. Nate, you are a hero to the world. Thank you for doing what you do, and listening to our show is another big thank you. Isn't it amazing that not only are there people out there doing things and changing the world for the better, some of them are listening to our show. And that's just
amazing.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I was looking at the pictures from their website of these big containers. They're like above ground swimming pool type containers they're growing kelp next to the ocean, it looks like, or lakes. And then they're taking that and trying to put it into cattle feed. And that would supplement the feed, but possibly reduce the belching of cows. I wonder if it would reduce my belching.
Well, you got to eat more seaweed and find out.
Okay, well, we got even more listener mail. This is from Bob. Bob sent us a news story on Canada trying to implement a pollution cap in light of opposition to the carbon pricing system currently in place, but it's declining in popularity because of inflation post-COVID. People are now more likely to blame things like carbon pricing and believe it when political parties say, hey, it's raising the price of your groceries. Not really, but whatever. So we have a link there for the National Observer that he sent us. So that's going to be in your show notes. The emissions cap mentioned in the article aims to limit the total greenhouse gases. That's what an emissions cap is. It's a little different than carbon pricing that oil and gas companies in Canada can emit. Instead of setting limits on production, it sets a maximum allowable level of pollution. So you can produce whatever you want, but you can only produce so much pollution while you're doing it. So that incentivizes them to, if they want to sell stuff, they have to do it with less pollution and pollution and invest in things that will lower that emissions. The government expects companies to follow stricter environmental standards and use cleaner technologies to stay under this cap. If a company goes over, it might face penalties or be required to invest in emissions-reducing technologies like carbon capture or renewable energy. The idea is to ensure that the industry works towards reducing its environmental impact without necessarily reducing the output. It'd be good to reduce the output too. Of course, we can't burn any oil. Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith and other conservatives are opposing it. I saw an ad on TV last night. It was a football game or something like that, and just kind of watching after supper, and there was an ad putting down the carbon cap or the pollution cap. So, yeah, the plan puts pressure on conservatives who seem, to ignore climate change. I don't know what their plan is. You don't have one. So don't do business in Alberta, Canada.
I will not. All right, and yet we have more listener mail. This is from Larry. Hi, I was wondering if you'd be interested in doing a plug for our organization, the Saskatchewan Renewable Energy Coalition, on your show by doing an interview with one of our group members. We're comprised of individuals and organizations connected to our province, including members from industry, government, academics, and the nonprofit sector, working to educate the public on renewable energy to accelerate our province's transition to renewable energy. If you're interested, get in touch. And there's a link to the website, which I assume you will put in the show notes, renewablesask.ca. And rather than doing an interview, we're just reading this letter instead. We don't do interviews all that often, but giving a plug for such a wonderful organization seems like a good idea.
Yeah, we don't do interviews. It's not, people kind of expect us to. We get, my inbox is full every day with people asking for interviews with this specialist and this expert and this CEO. But that's not what we do. We're a news podcast, and we might branch off, who knows, someday into something else as well. But for now, we're just trying to disseminate and discuss clean energy news for the week. But thanks for the letter, Bob, and thanks for listening to our show. Most people who do fill my inbox are not listening to the show, and it's pretty clear that they're pretending to. But you too can contact us, because we love to hear from our listeners. Please contact us by email, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. And you can do what Nate did and leave us a voicemail. Hopefully he wasn't driving at the time with a bunch of kelp in the car. Was it kelp or seaweed? I can't remember. It was kelp?
Isn't that the same thing?
Yeah, maybe. Okay, Nate, maybe you need to leave us another voicemail. But that's great what you're doing, and we appreciate you leaving us a voicemail. It's wonderful to hear the voices of our listeners. Speakpipe.com/clean energy show is how you do that if you wanted to do that, and always do that. But if you don't, if you're shy, if you want to be more careful with your text, you can email us, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. You can also join the conversation on our Patreon page, which is the new social media hub of clean energy, the Clean Energy Show Patreon page, which has some public posts, some posts that you have to sign up and be a member for free, and some posts that are for our paid members, like our bonus podcast.
So there's a song, I don't know if you remember, by the Canadian band Sloan, that starts with a siren at the beginning of the song.
Yeah.
And if you ever hear it when you're driving your car, you for a moment, you're like, oh crap, there's a siren.
It's the fuzz.
All right, very quickly here from Bloomberg, Exxon CEO pushes back on Trump's anti-climate change agenda. So the CEO of Exxon, the famously polluting oil company, is trying to suggest that the U.S. not get out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And it is really for selfish reasons. He thinks that probably the oil companies will have more influence if we actually stay in the Paris Agreement and, look for what he calls common sense carbon cutting policy. So, yes, the CEO of Exxon is saying that the U.S. should stay in the Paris Agreement, but, maybe not with the best possible motivations for that.
Best possible motivation? Why do you think they're doing it, Brian? I don't understand.
Well, I think he's correct. I think that they can have more influence if they do participate. The U.S. is a very large voice, so, they can always shift the discussion slightly in one direction or another. So just getting out of it means they have no voice at all. That's
right. Well, interesting, but kind of scary as well. So, we don't have a huge lightning round this week, but it is coming up later in the show, by the way. And I will plug our Patreon page. If you become a member of our Patreon page, our Patreon member, you can get bonus materials, early access to the show, ad-free stuff on the show, and bonus materials. And that is true also if you're on Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe for just $1.99 a month, and you'll get an abbreviated bonus podcast and other materials, and also early access to the show and no ads. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, and I know some of you are, we got a lot of people watching on various platforms, but YouTube is not the biggest one, but that's the one where you can buy a membership, much like you can on Patreon, and get access, early access, ad-free, and stuff like that, as well as our bonus content. So patreon.com, search for The Clean Energy Show. The link is also in your show notes.
Okay, this story is from The Guardian. The energy regulator in the UK has approved 3 subsea cable projects that will link Great Britain to the power grids in Germany, Ireland, and Northern Ireland to help share renewable electricity across borders. This is going to be a much bigger thing in the coming years as more clean energy comes online. So currently, Great Britain has a combined capacity of 11.7 gigawatts of these undersea cables that are already operating or under construction. And these new projects will take this to 12 gigawatts in 2030 and then 18 gigawatts by 2032. And the goal of this is for the UK to be a net exporter of electricity, largely coming from the offshore wind farms that they have there that have the potential to create lots and lots of clean energy. But, when you got too much, you need to be able to ship it somewhere. And undersea cables is a great way to do it. And, again, not happening immediately or anything. These are very large projects that can take a long time to complete. But nevertheless, it's happening.
Yeah, the undersea cables are good for sharing as well, right? We think about different regions having sun, some regions having sun, or cloud rather, or wind and no wind, night and day, or sunset and late afternoon. And we can share. That's an important aspect of the variability of renewables, is to be able to have grid connections and to share. And Europe's doing, probably the best job, but then there's a lot of different countries in a small area. A lot of good opportunities for undersea cables as well. And coming up, it is the lightning round. Stay tuned. It's time for the lightning round. Toyota calls California EV rules impossible.
Impossible.
Maybe it's because you have no EVs, you jackwagons. Get some EVs. I like to use the word jackwagon. It's a long story. You have to listen to previous shows to find out why. But there's a link to Inside EVs, who wrote an article on that. Of course, poor Toyota is not moving forward in the world because, it's just impossible. Well, no one else is complaining, huh? Environmentalist Bill McKibben says this: how many people could you tell that over the course of the American election campaign cycle, we passed the line where humans are installing a gigawatt worth, that's a nuclear power plant's worth, of solar panels each day? They passed that threshold somewhere in the election cycle of the U.S. election, in the last few months, 1 gigawatt a day. And at its peak, it can output the power of a nuclear power plant at midday for...
Yeah, I don't remember that coming up during the election cycle.
No. Since 2019, emissions from private jets surged by almost 50%. Brian, you have to park that thing.
Damn.
The Clean Energy Show jet needs to spend more time on the tarmac. A solar panel on the roof is worth 2 in the field, says environmental advocate Jesse Pelton. And that is because if you look at a pie chart of the cost of electricity, more than half is the generation. But there's a pretty significant 2/3 of that, or pardon me, 1/3 or 40% even, depends on the grid, of course, but that is used for distribution and transmission. And transmission is long-term over high-voltage power lines, and distribution is the substations and so forth, and the thing at the end of your block with a capacitor on it and things like that. That all costs a lot of money. It has to be repaired. But if you put the generation on people's roofs, there is an advantage to that because you don't have to pay for the other aspect. Now, this is debatable, okay? This is highly debatable. It's not really literally 1 on the roof is worth 2 in the field. But it does go to show that there's a big advantage to what they call distributed solar, putting it on roofs and schools and everything else, and not just big farms.
Yeah, there's a huge simplicity to that. You and I both have solar panels on our roofs, and it might be cloudy out now. I'm not sure. I'm down here in my bomb shelter, but theoretically, the power is coming right from my roof and into this microphone and recording this podcast, and the same thing at your house.
You know what your bomb shelter doesn't have? A closed circuit camera on the outside world.
Yeah.
And some bomb shelters actually have that, so you can look for zombies or whatever might be coming after you.
I might come out of here after the podcast and find that my whole street has been leveled and I wouldn't know.
Also a weather station. You need a weather station with and that's right beside the monitor on the outside where, it's time for a CS Fast Fact. Women are setting the example for climate change we want to see. Women are 2.5 times more likely to engage on climate issues and 60% more likely to advocate for social good, except, of course, voters in the United States. Sorry, had to make that this. Donald Trump is considering tapping North Dakota's Doug Bergman for his new energy SAR, which would give the oil state's governor sweeping power to slash environmental regulations and boost U.S. fossil fuel output. Well, go ahead. He's a billionaire businessman. Brian, you know what this is? We're going to have some rough waters here in the next while.
Yeah.
But he's an oligarchy. This is an oligarchy or an oiligarchy. This is when rich people are running the government and having such influence. It's just nothing feels right about this.
And there had been some progress recently on the leaking methane from the oil fields in North Dakota. There was some steps towards getting that under control, and, that might not be happening now. We'll see.
Baoshan, essentially one of China's cheapest car makers, has revealed their Tianyu four-wheel intelligent drive technology that can rotate each wheel 90 degrees for sideways parking. Now, the Cybertruck and the Hummer EV have crab walking, like their rear wheels
four-wheel steering.
But they're not 90 degrees. This thing is like something from a movie where it completely turns and you go, to the right into your parking spot that is like an inch bigger than your vehicle, perhaps.
That seems really difficult, especially from a cheaper car maker.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, maybe you can just drive sideways down the street if they get stuck. I can just picture that now. Another CES Fast Fact. Heat pumps reduce gas consumption even if running 100% on electricity from gas-fired power plants. So if your grid is 100% gas, you're using less gas, like you, by going to a heat pump.
Yeah, and of course, we have some coal on our grid, and I'm running an air source heat pump to heat my home. I always kind of figured at a rough estimation that maybe my emissions are about the same because of the coal that's on our grid. But if it was all gas-fired, it would be cleaner. Well, so I don't know. Maybe I'm saving some emissions as well.
Even our grid's getting cleaner, every so often with the opening of a new solar farm, a new wind farm. It's slow, but it is essentially ostensibly getting cleaner. Hey, just days after Donald Trump's victory, Toyota becomes the first automaker to begin distancing itself from electric vehicles. Quelle surprise! The company is now saying the Biden-Harris EV rules are, quote, not in alignment with consumers. Screw you, Toyota. I know we've got people who actually work at Toyota plants, but I have to express my anger at Toyota when I can, and that is right now. And you know what? I was thinking the other day about the reliability of my Chevy EV. That wouldn't it be nice to have a Toyota? I would love to buy a Toyota EV.
Yeah.
Just not going to happen, though, because there's only one and it's expensive and not efficient and not very thoughtfully made.
I have great fondness for all the Japanese automakers because that's kind of, those are the cool cars when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. And Nissan just had an announcement that they're having huge layoffs. They're really struggling. Of course, they do have some EVs, but they're not great. So, it's going to be a rough road for the Japanese automakers in the coming days.
So this is the time of year when things get really busy climate-wise, U.S. election or not. This is the COP29, the cooperation of the parties. The CEO of that annual climate summit where all the world gets together, even Russia, and it's in an oil state for the second year in a row, Azerbaijan. The CEO of, which is the local person from the country that is getting hosted in, he was filmed agreeing to facilitate fossil fuel deals at the climate summit. So somebody pranked him and said, hey, would you facilitate some at the climate? And he said, sure. Yeah. So That's actually going to be our last story this week. It's a sour note. The chief executive of COP29 has been filmed apparently agreeing to facilitate fossil fuel deals at the climate summit. The recording has amplified calls by campaigners who want the fossil fuel industry and its lobbyists to be banned from future COP talks. Can't argue with that. The campaign group Global Witness posed undercover as a fake oil and gas group asking for deals to be facilitated in exchange for sponsoring the event. In the calls, Elnur Sultanov, Azerbaijan's deputy energy minister and chief executive of COP29, agreed to this and spoke of a future that includes fossil fuels, perhaps forever, quote unquote. COP officials have introduced the fake investor to a senior executive at the national oil and gas company SOCAR to discuss investment opportunities. So, yes, I ended on a sour note this week. It's been a sour week, and yeah, but I will say this. I'm going to end on a quote from Jan Rosenau, a fellow at the Energy Institute. He says on Twitter, "Pessimists sound clever, optimists change the world." And here at the Clean Energy Show, you can better believe we remain optimists, Brian.
Absolutely. That's our show for this week. You can contact us, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. Around social media, we are Clean Energy Pod. You can join our Patreon community for free. There's a free level and paid levels as well. You can support the show with a purchase from the Clean Energy merch store that's listed in the show notes. And you can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever your favorite podcast app is. And please remember to follow us on that podcast app, and you will get new episodes delivered every week.
And thanks again to all of our Patreon members, Apple Podcast subscribers, YouTube membership holders for supporting the Clean Energy Show. We will give you a shout out next week. Your names of certain levels will be in the credits of our video project. Join our Patreon today and get all that stuff that I mentioned earlier, and it'll be great to have you and lots of fun when people join up. And just check us out. If you're not going to support us financially, check out our Patreon page because we do post stuff there from time to time. Hey, if you're in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan this weekend, I'll be at the Saskatoon Film Festival this Saturday, moderating a panel on the films of our friend that we've mentioned before, Lowell Dean. Will be showing 4 feature films. We'll see how many I make it through without snoring aloud in public. But yeah, 11 a.m. on Saturday, and we'll see how my EV makes it in the winter. I'll probably talk about that next week. So we'll see you again in 7 days, everyone.
Yeah, and I think you're in at least one of those films.
At least
look
one.
For James in Wolf Cop, and yeah, we'll see you next week.
The Clean Energy Show.